to the Middle East we go now, and the Syrian government has fallen. It's a seismic shift in the politics of Syria. Um, ends the more than 50-year regime of the al-Assad family. President Bashar al-Assad, who we now understand has fled to Moscow. He ruled for 24 years. His father, Hafez al-Assad, ruled since 1980. And with widespread celebration within that particular country. But let's be a little bit nuanced about this. What does it now mean for Syria? We know what happened in Libya after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, that there has been an ongoing civil war in that country for the last few years now. To try and explain and pick at some of the nuances in this particular conversation, Zeenat Adam is the Deputy Executive Director of the Afro-Middle East Centre. Of course, we allow and you understand and we appreciate the widespread celebration after the fall of the Bashar al-Assad presidency, but also the more than 50 years of rule of that particular family, Zina. But a more nuanced conversation would say, let's also be cautious of what comes out and what happens after this. Will there be a stable, transitional, constitutional-based government now in Syria, with a transition that will now take place? The current Prime Minister says that he would work with an incoming elective government. But your thoughts on what transpired very, very quickly over the last 48 hours and over the last 12 days, Zeenat?
Good morning, Lester. Good morning to the listeners. Yes, absolutely. It is a seismic shift that we're looking at. And I think while we support the elation and the euphoric sentiments of the Syrian people, the rest of the world is concerned about how this would play out, with multiple actors having vested interests in Syria, and this has been for a long period, certainly since the 2011 Arab Spring uprising, and then of course by 2015 we saw Russia and Iran entering the space in support of Bashar al-Assad. We've seen attacks across the Turkish border. We also know that the Americans still hold vast areas of Syria in the eastern province, along with Kurdish parties. And last night we witnessed Israel incurring 14 kilometers into Syria and attacking with heavy bombardment military and intelligence installations in the Syrian territory. So it is going to be a very interesting and dynamic space as the Syrians begin to understand what is happening, as they begin to accept that 54 years of the Ba'ath Party has come to an end, and considering what this means with the united opposition led by the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and whether that coalition is going to deliver some stability and good governance.
Talk to me about what could be a very tenuous coalition, because you had the HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, leading what's known as the rebel factions, launching offences onto the Bashar government. But then you also, in the north, you have Kurdish militants who also don't sit around the same fire as HTS, also don't sit around the same fire. In fact, open conflict with the northern neighbor of Syria, Turkey. So there seems to be plenty of moving parts and own individualized interests of many groups, and we hope that there's somehow some stability in what is a mosh-posh of interests. But the way I look at it at the moment, many people saying that's unlikely. This could open up even more conflict and disorder, particularly in Syria, broader Levant.
Well, it's certainly an unknown at this stage. And I think when we look at the situation with the Kurds, they still have a limited warfare with the Turks across the border. The Turkish government has somewhat supported HTS in their movement here. In terms of how this happened, what we're learning now is that Iran realized that something was being cooked along the way. 6 months ago, they approached Assad. He turned them down because he felt that he was secure now being welcomed back into the Arab League and being supported by the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Later, Turkey approached Assad and tried to reach out for discussions and negotiations with the opposition. He turned that down. And it appears from the statements that came out of Doha from the Astana process partners, those were the group of countries that were trying originally to reach an agreement in Syria, that there seems to have been a great deal of frustration with Assad. And this is part of the reason why the opposition was able to so swiftly move from the north down towards Damascus and essentially take over and ousting Assad very, very quickly.
The reports, particularly from Western media, on how the leader of HTS, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, reinventing himself. He is a product. He was a former commander in ISIL. His character somewhat being softened, distancing himself from militant Islamist elements who have been fighting against Bashar al-Assad. Just what's your thoughts on that in and his previous involvement with groups like ISIL and Al-Qaeda?
He was aligned with Al-Qaeda previously. He seems to have reinvented himself, and there seems to be a great deal of maturity in terms of how he is approaching this maneuver and the tactics that he is employing. So it is very interesting to see him turn from rebel to politician, and that seems to be the transition and the evolution that he has taken. I think it's worth pointing out that last night the USA targeted ISIS in certain pockets in Syria as well. Apparently 75 targets were hit from Central Command in Qatar. So it really is becoming quite an interesting space. But I think for me, the most striking has been the release of prisoners from various prisons, especially from Sednaya, where hundreds of thousands are still in some kind of dungeons that are inaccessible, and others have been released. And what we're witnessing is that these are people who possibly could have been held for 40 years, up to 40 years, some for the last 20 years, some within the space since the Arab uprising, and without any access to the outside world. We witnessed also footage of children being held in these prisons. It's unclear whether those children were actually born out of the torture in this. So from a human rights perspective, very concerning.
And you're right, as you prefaced our conversation, you appreciate the elation, the celebration that many people, particularly in Syria, have received this news. But it's also about the duality, what's going through the heads of many Western leaders at the moment. Yes, it's the end of 24 years of Bashar al-Assad, but at the same time, is who we are dealing with now, and who could be the recognized leadership of Syria. Are they trusted brokers to deal with, particularly within the West's interests?
It does seem from the way in which it's being reported in the West is that there seems to be some kind of appetite to deal with Jawlani and the opposition groups. Whether that indicates that there would be rapprochement completely and whether there would be full recognition of a transitional government is yet to be seen. That would, of course, impact on whether or not sanctions against Syria will be lifted and whether they would be able to uplift the economy, which would have a major impact in terms of stability and governance moving forward. We're also witnessing a number of those who were displaced and refugees, 7 million refugees around the world, many of whom have said that they are wanting to return to Syria now.
Zeenat Adam, really appreciate your time, Executive Director for the Afro-Middle East Centre. Because that's the conversation that's happening. Plenty of celebration within the West of the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime. Big ally of Vladimir Putin, big ally of Iran, but with Bashar al-Assad in power, keeping those who are seen as also enemies of the West, Al Qaeda, ISIS, also at base. So, what really is then the consequences of the fall of the Assad regime? We wait and see.